I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria Automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria Automation.
In this video, we're going to see how to use the REST API to determine what roles have been assigned to an account. Now, if you're using Postman, as we've been doing, you've already specified your user credentials, you're presumably already familiar with that account, and presumably already familiar with what roles have been assigned to that account. But you're not always going to be using Postman. You might be creating your own REST client, and that REST client might allow the end user to specify their own credentials. In that case, you're not going to know what roles have been assigned to that account unless you look them up. So that's why we're going to talk about how to do this through the REST API. Now, before we jump in and learn about this, as you can see here, we have two different REST requests that we're going to be using. Just taking a look at the first one as an example, please notice that it requires that you specify the organization ID for your Aria Automation environment. Now, that's a topic we talked about in the previous video. If you have not already seen the previous video and how we can use the get organization ID request to get that ID, make certain you go back and view that previous video. Now, I could go straight in and start running these two requests, but I think it would be worth taking a few moments to go look at roles in the Aria Automation GUI. If you don't understand the roles there, then this isn't going to make any sense. So let's go over to Aria Automation. And as you can see, I'm at the login screen. Let me click on go to login page. So here's the actual login screen. I'm going to log in as this account that I usually use. You could use any account though. But I'm going to log into this account, and when I sign in, the first thing I want you to notice is that on this initial page, I can see services, identity and access management, and branding. What determines what you're going to see here over in the navigation bar is your organization role or roles. If you are an organization member, that's one role, then you will be able to see services over here on the left, and you'll see the services you've been entitled here over on the right. But that's it. Organization members only see services. On the other hand, if you're logged in as an organization owner, which I currently am, you will see services. You always see services, whether you're an organization member or an organization owner. But as an organization owner, you're also going to see identity, access management, and branding. Now, branding, as you can see here, just allows you to set the colors and font and the look and feel of Aria Automation, but we're not here to talk about branding. We want to talk about role-based access control. So we're going to go over here to the identity and access management section, and as you can see, there's a section here for looking at the roles that have been assigned to users specifically, versus this is a screen that shows you the roles that have been assigned to groups of users. Ordinarily, I like to work with groups of users, simply because there are typically far fewer groups than there are individual users. It's easier to assign roles to a few groups than it is to lots and lots of users. However, in this particular video, I'm actually going to take a look at assigning roles on a per user basis. And we're actually going to learn about both users and groups, but let's focus first on assigning roles to users. So when you go to this screen and you look at this list of active users, you'll spot right here, this is the account that I'm logged in as. So that eng-ca-admin account, we've assigned it the name John Smith. If we take a look at this screen and perhaps expand this here, you can see information about this user and the roles that have been assigned to him. The first thing I want you to notice is that there are both organization roles and service roles. We're going to talk about the difference between them. Right now, I can tell from this right here that as far as this specific user is concerned, we have directly assigned the organization owner role to this specific user. And additionally, we have assigned some service roles, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, as you can see in this organization roles column, some of the accounts have been assigned organization owner. This account has been assigned organization owner, which is why he can see services, identity and access management, and branding. On the other hand, users like David Jones, who's just a member, would only see the services section. Now, there's a lot of information here, but where this gets really interesting is if you select a user and then edit the user. So when you edit the user's roles, there are two sections here. There's a section on top that specifies this user's organization roles, and a section down the bottom that describes the service roles that have been assigned to that account. Now we're going to focus first on these organization roles. Right now, you can see that this specific user has been directly assigned the role called organization owner, which is, again, why he can see these three different sections. But if you look real closely here, you'll notice that he's also receiving role assignments based on what groups he's a member of. Let's click show and take a look at what I mean here. So there are two groups. There are actually a whole bunch more groups if you look in this section here, but there are two groups that this user belongs to. He's a member of eng-ca-users at vclass.local and eng-ca-admins at vclass.local. One of those groups has been assigned organization member role at the group level, and the other's been assigned organization owner at the group level. So if we were to go over to enterprise groups, we would see exactly that. We would see this group has this role, this group has this org role, and furthermore, we'd see that this specific user, along with others, are members of both of these groups. So by virtue of the groups that this particular user is a member of, not only is he an organization owner, he's also an organization member. He has both roles assigned to him. So here we have the roles that have been assigned to him specifically, but additionally, we can also see what roles have been assigned to him by virtue of the groups that he's a member of. So let's simplify this here, and from here on out, we'll just say that this user is an organization owner. In addition to the organization role that's been assigned to this account, we also see the service roles that have been assigned to this account. And you'll notice that those service roles are divided up into these different categories. Let's start with this one down here on the bottom. This happens to be vRealize Automation 8.10, which used to call this thing called Cloud Assembly. Nowadays, Aria Automation calls it Assembler. But whatever name you use it here, that's one of the major categories of service roles we can choose from. Here are the others. In the Cloud Assembly category, there are 5 different service roles that we could assign. One's called Cloud Assembly Administrator, one's called Cloud Assembly User, another's called Cloud Assembly Viewer. Those 3 service roles are listed in order of decreasing power. So Administrator is super powerful, Viewer is the least powerful of these 3. And additionally, that same Cloud Assembly category also has 2 other types of service roles that have to do with the migration assistant. As you can see, for all these other categories, we can do the same thing. For example, in Service Broker, we could have given any combination of these 3 service roles, but in this particular case, we've given this specific user Service Broker Administrator role. So for for SaltStack Config, now known as Aria Automation Config, we have roles that we can assign there. CodeStream is now known as Aria Automation Pipelines, but whatever you call it, we have these different service roles that we can assign. And Orchestrator has its own services that we can assign. So by virtue of the service roles that we're assigning, let me go ahead and hit cancel here. By virtue of the service roles that we're assigning, that's determining what services this user can see, and furthermore, when they go into those services, what they're going to be able to do. So anytime you are working with Aria Automation and working with accounts, what controls whether or not the user can get in, and what they see on this initial screen are the organization role that you assign to the account. And the service roles, on the other hand, controls what services they're going to be able to see and what they can do with those. All right, so that's a bit of background in how role-based access control works in Aria Automation. Let's go back and take a look in Postman. And looking here, as you can see, we have two different requests that I've defined. One's going to look up the organization roles for the account that I'm authenticated as, and the other request is going to look up the service roles. Let's do the first. So we'll select Get Organization Roles. Here is our endpoint URL, and it's fairly straightforward, but you're perhaps asking yourself, how did I know what this endpoint URL is? Specifically, how did I know this part here, CSP, gateway, API, logged in, user, orgs? Well, one answer to that question, how to know what the endpoint URL is, something that you already know. You know that we could go to developer, helps if you spell it correctly, developer.vmware.com/APIs. And amongst all of these gazillion different APIs, there are a bunch of APIs that have to do with vRealize automation, now known as Aria Automation. So we could go looking through all these different VRA APIs to find the one that's used for looking up role assignments. And that would be fine. We could find the information that we need. But that's not how I happen to have found the endpoint URL information. The way I found it was through a document, I believe I've mentioned this in earlier videos, a document called the vRealize Automation API Programming Guide. Now, as you can see here, I'm looking at an older version of this document simply because that's the version of this document that I happen to have used when I first started exploring how to look up roles. And I seem to recall that if I go to page 11 in this document, you can see that there's a section here that talks about how to look up roles. And here it's using the term roles generically, but we know that that means both looking up organization roles and service roles. Looking at the information here, you can see the actual endpoint URL that I'm using in the request itself. So if you'd like to, you can read through this document, or you can look at the same information in the newer version of this document, but ultimately I wanted to show you how I came to find what the endpoint URL is. So that's enough with the documentation. Let's actually use that information. So in this REST request, get organization roles, we're going to our VRA server, we're going to the endpoint URL, CSP, gateway, AM, API, logged in, user, orgs, and crucially, as part of the endpoint URL, we're sending in the organization ID for the VRA server that I'm logged into. Again, the previous video showed you how to use the organization ID REST request to look up that information. /roles is the endpoint URL. And then after the question mark here, let me highlight that again. After the question mark here, we have a query string that's specifying specifically which version of the VRA API that we want to use. Again, you'll recall we set that up with a REST request here in the About folder. So this is a fairly straightforward URL once you know how to write it. And as you can see, looking at it here, there's no need to send in any body. And there's no pre-request script that's necessary. And strictly speaking, there's no test that's required either. We could, if we wanted to, write some code here to save the information that's just about to get returned here. So for example, if you want to save the information about the organization roles, you could write some JavaScript code here that would save that information as a Postman variable. But I've strived here to keep this particular REST request very simple and straightforward. So with this simple and straightforward REST request, let's click send and see what happens. When we click send, first thing I check is what status code did I get in the response? I got a 200 series code. That's good. And as we can see here, we've got some response body in JSON format. And in that JSON formatted stuff, we've got information about the organization roles that have been assigned to this specific user. Now, lines 2 through 12 are revealing to us that this user is an organization member. You can see that here also with the display name. So this user is an organization member. Additionally, on lines 14 through 22, we can also see that that user is a organization owner. And from our previous discussion, we know what that's going to mean in terms of what this user is going to be able to do. They're going to be able to see the services, the identity and access management, and branding because they're an organization owner. So we've got all this great information plus some links that we can use. So if you want to look up information about the org that this specific user is associated with, or if you want to link to get back to the same information again, we've got all that information in here and we're ready to go because you now have one crucial piece of information. You now know for the account that we're logged in as what the organization role is. Where things typically get a bit more interesting though is the service roles. So let's go look at this request. Again, this request, you already essentially know how I found the URL for this here. Notice that the key thing that's different here in this endpoint URL is that instead of /roles, it's service-roles. But otherwise, this URL looks awfully similar to the URL that we just saw in the previous REST request. Once again, no need for any fancy body, no pre-request scripts, no test scripts. Although again, the test scripts is where you might choose to write some JavaScript code to save the information that we're just about to receive here. But again, we have a fairly straightforward request. Let's click send and see what happens. As always, I check I got a 200, that's good. And we can see that I've got a bunch of JSON formatted data here in the response body. There's so much here. This time I think it'll be better if we copy, so I'm clicking the copy button. I'm going to copy this JSON code and I'm going to go paste it over here into Notepad++. In Notepad++, I've already installed the JSON Tools plugin. I'm going to pretty print my JSON data. I'm also going to show the JSON tree viewer. It'll make it a little easier to understand what is going on in this file. And additionally, I am going to collapse everything. So I'm going to start over here in the JSON tree viewer. I'm going to expand a little bit, and you'll notice that in this JSON data, that at the top level, there's an array called service roles. In fact, if we go look at the actual JSON data itself, we can see that is in fact true. That's an array, and that particular array, in this specific case, has 5 elements, numbered 0 through 4. Now that number 5 perhaps rings a bell. Back in the GUI, under Identity and Access Management, active users, when we looked at John Smith, when we actually edited his roles, we saw that he had service roles from these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different categories. The array has 5 elements because there are 5 different categories of service roles. So going back to our Notepad++ JSON data, each of these corresponds to one of those categories. So let's just go from top to bottom, starting with element 0. So element 0 here is for service roles that are related to service broker, which, if I recall correctly, does in fact match the order that we saw over here. So this is, the element 0 is going to talk about service broker and in this case, one of 3 possible service roles that we have assigned. So again, in our JSON data, we can see that there are 2 additional arrays within this array. The service roles name array has 1 element for each of the services that we've assigned. So we assigned the service broker administrator role, and therefore, since there's only one of those checkboxes checked there's only 1 element in this particular array. If we expand service roles, we see the same information again, but with a bit more detail. In particular, this information here is telling you how the user received this service role. So again, as we know from our earlier discussion, service roles can be assigned at the user level, or in this case, it's at the group level. So again, that's the basic structure that we see here. And again, if we go over to the left side of the page, we can see the exact same information. So again, this is our first of 5 different elements in the service roles array. Why don't we jump down? Let me collapse this here. We'll collapse this over here. Let's go look at service roles and look at the 5th and final entry there. So again, let me collapse things a bit here. Let's go into element 4, the 5th one, and we'll go ahead and expand here and notice that the service roles name array in this case has 1, 2, 3 different elements. And that's because what we're looking at here is the service roles associated with Cloud Assembly. Again, we've got 3 different roles. Let me scroll up a bit here. Let's try that again. We've got 3 different service roles that we assigned that all fell in this category. We've got Cloud Assembly Administrator, Cloud Assembly User, and Migration Assistant Administrator. Looking at the JSON data, we've got Cloud Assembly Administrator. I know that's not what this says verbatim, but that's what this means. Automation Service : Cloud Admin means this user has been assigned the Cloud Assembly admin right. They've also been assigned the Cloud Assembly User service role, and additionally the Migration Assistant Administrator role. And again, if we want to see even more detail, if we go into service roles for each of these, we can see information about each specific service role assignment, including whether the user received the role assignment by virtue of having that role assigned directly to them or by virtue of what group they are in. All right, so back to Postman. Again, in this video, we've talked about 2 different REST requests. I would encourage you to try these out with different accounts. And in order to really understand what's going on, it'd be a great idea if you not only use Postman to see the results of running the REST request, but also have an instance of the Aria Automation GUI up and running so that you can see exactly what roles that particular account's been assigned.
Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.